On the remote island of Mona, off the wild coast of Britannia, battle-hardened Roman soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, froze. They weren't facing a superior army or a new, terrifying weapon. Their limbs were heavy, their shields hung limp, and they stood motionless, exposed and ready for the slaughter. They were paralyzed by the chilling chants and dreadful curses of the Druids. This is the story of how a spiritual order, a brotherhood of priests and keepers of ancient lore, used the power of psychological warfare to become one of the only enemies Rome truly feared. A foe they sought not merely to conquer, but to completely and utterly erase from existence. Two worlds collide. To understand the sheer impact of that moment on the shores of Mona, we first have to understand the two worlds that were about to collide. They weren't just opposing armies, they were opposing realities. First, there was Rome. Picture the world of a first-century Roman legionary. He is a product of one of the most organized and pragmatic societies the world had ever known. His world is one of straight roads, rigid hierarchies, and written laws. The gods he knows, Jupiter, Mars, Juno, are patrons of the state. They are powerful, yes, but they are understood. Their worship is a civic duty, another pillar supporting the grand structure of Rome. This soldier has marched across deserts and forests. He's seen berserkers charge his lines and scythed chariots try to break them. He's faced war elephants. He is desensitized to the mundane horrors of war. His entire training, from the moment he took his oath, the sacramentum, was meant to strip away individual fear and replace it with collective discipline. The world was a problem to be solved, and the Roman legion was the solution. Now imagine another world, a world without straight roads or sprawling cities of marble. This is the world of the Celts. It's a world of deep, ancient forests, swirling mists, and sacred springs. Here the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural are thin, almost non-existent. The gods aren't confined to temples. They live in the gnarled bark of an old oak, in the current of a river, in the flight of a raven across a grey sky. Power isn't found in written lore, but in shared culture, epic poems recited around a fire, and a profound spiritual connection to the land itself. And at the very heart of this world, acting as its brain and its soul, were the Druids. We often picture them as simple, white-robed priests, but this is a pale shadow of their true role. The Druids were the intellectual elite of Celtic society. They were the judges who settled disputes, from a stolen cow to a conflict between kings. To be excommunicated by them was a social death sentence. They were the teachers, entrusted with educating the children of the nobility. This was no simple education. Some later sources claim a Druid in training could spend up to 20 years committing vast amounts of knowledge to memory, studying astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and the intricate laws of their people. They were the living libraries of a culture that believed its sacred knowledge was too powerful to be written down. Most importantly, they were the mediators between worlds. They were believed to be able to read the future, commune with the gods, and understand life's greatest mystery, death. A core belief the Romans reported on was the transmigration of souls, a form of reincarnation. The Druids taught that death wasn't an end, but merely a doorway to another life. This single belief made Celtic warriors ferocious in battle. Why fear an end that is merely a new beginning? So you have these two forces moving towards each other. One, an empire of physical force and engineering, seeking to conquer and impose its structure on the world. The other, a spiritual and intellectual force that bound a people to their land and beliefs. Rome knew how to fight armies. It knew how to besiege forts. But it had never faced an enemy whose primary weapon was the very idea of reality itself. The stage was being set for a conflict that would be fought not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of the soldiers. The inciting incident, Caesar's gaze turns north. The first Roman to truly stare into this enigmatic world and report back was Julius Caesar. During his conquest of Gaul in the 50s BC, he came face to face with the immense power the Druids wielded. His writings, the commentaries on the Gallic War, give us our first detailed, though deeply biased, Roman perspective on this priesthood, and what he saw both fascinated and terrified him. Caesar was a pragmatist. He looked at Gallic society and immediately identified the Druids as the central pillar of power. He noted with a mix of respect and strategic concern that they were exempt from military service and paid no taxes. This set them apart, giving them an air of untouchable authority. He described their annual gatherings in the land of the Carnutes, considered the center of Gaul, where they sat as the supreme court for the entire region. In a fractured landscape of competing chieftains, the Druids were the only truly pan-tribal authority. They were the glue that could bind the Gauls together against him, but it was their religious practices that truly captured the Roman imagination. Caesar is our primary source for the most enduring and terrifying image associated with the Druids, the wicker man. He described colossal figures woven from branches, their hollow limbs filled with living men, which were then set ablaze as a sacrifice to the gods. Caesar wrote, "They believe that unless the life of a man be offered for the life of a man, the mind of the immortal gods cannot be rendered propitious." He claimed criminals were preferred, but when the supply ran short, they would sacrifice the innocent. Imagine reading this in Rome. It was perfect propaganda. It painted the Gauls not just as a military enemy, but as a morally depraved people in desperate need of Roman civilization. But it was more than propaganda. It reflected a genuine culture clash. The Romans, who had practiced human sacrifice in their own distant past, now saw it as the ultimate taboo. Other writers, like Diodorus Siculus, described Druids divining the future by stabbing a victim and reading the omens from their convulsions. Whether these accounts were accurate, exaggerated, or a mix of both, their impact was the same. They created an image of a priesthood steeped in blood, one that held power through fear and dark ritual. For Caesar, this was a clear and present danger. The Druids were the intellectual architects of resistance. Their doctrine of reincarnation fueled the bravery of Gallic warriors. Their authority could rally tribes that would otherwise never cooperate. To truly conquer Gaul, the legions couldn't just defeat the warriors. They had to break the power of the priests who gave them their strength. Caesar's conquest was the inciting incident. He had opened the door, and for the next century, Rome would develop a policy not of containment, but of annihilation, driven by a cocktail of strategic necessity and profound, visceral fear. The Druids were now an official enemy of the Roman state. Rising action, the campaign of suppression. Caesar had identified the threat. The emperors who followed would seek to eliminate it. The fear of the Druids festered in the Roman psyche, morphing from a battlefield report into imperial policy. Under Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius, a systematic campaign to dismantle Druidism began. This wasn't a holy war. The Romans were generally tolerant of local gods. This was different. This was political extermination, hiding behind a veil of moral outrage. The Emperor Augustus, based on what later sources tell us, may have decreed that no man could be both a Roman citizen and a Druid. Tiberius went further, banning native healers and seers. But it was the Emperor Claudius, in the mid-1st century AD, who took the most decisive step. He banned the practice of Druidism entirely, making their rituals illegal and declaring them outlaws. Why this relentless suppression? Because Roman authority could not tolerate a rival. The Druids were a shadow government, a source of persistent anti-Roman sentiment. They were the keepers of a national identity that resisted assimilation. To the orderly Roman mind, the Druids were a source of chaos, a spiritual infection that had to be purged. And the heart of this infection, its last great sanctuary, was believed to lie in the newly conquered province of Britannia, specifically on a windswept island off the coast of modern-day Wales. The Romans called it Mona. We know it today as Anglesey. By the year 60 AD, Anglesey was more than a sacred island. It was the nexus of British resistance. It was a refuge for dissidents, for warriors who refused to bend the knee, and for druids fleeing suppression in Gaul and Britain. It was the last great druidic university. For the Britons, Mona was a symbol of freedom. For the Romans, it was a tumor, and it had to be removed. The man tasked with this duty was Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, the governor of Britain. Suetonius was a competent and utterly ruthless commander. He saw the situation with cold clarity. As long as Mona stood as a beacon of resistance, the province would never be secure. And so, Suetonius gathered his forces, primarily the formidable Legio Patronitinth Gemina, and marched across Britain. He reached the coast of North Wales and stared across the narrow, treacherous Menai Strait. Mona lay before him, shrouded in mist and myth. He had a fleet of flat-bottomed boats built to ferry his infantry across the wild currents, while his cavalry would swim alongside their horses. Imagine the scene. These were seasoned soldiers, yet an unease must have spread through the ranks. This wasn't just another hill fort. They were about to attack the sacred heart of the enemy, the lair of the so-called sorcerers their commanders had described. As they boarded the boats, they were rowing towards a confrontation that would test the very limits of their courage. The climax. The shore of terror. The Roman boats pushed into the grey waters of the Menai Strait. The legionaries, packed tightly, would have felt the cold spray, their eyes fixed on the opposing shore. As they drew closer, the scene resolved into a vision from a nightmare. This wasn't a familiar shield wall of warriors. This was something else entirely. The historian Tacitus, whose father-in-law was present, provides the only surviving and chillingly vivid account. He writes, "On the shore stood the opposing army with its dense array of armed warriors. This was expected, but then, while between the ranks dashed women in black attire like the Furies, with hair disheveled waving brands. Let that image sink in. You are a Roman soldier. You see women in funereal black, their hair wild, running like mad specters through the lines, brandishing flaming torches. In Roman myth, the Furies were terrifying deities of vengeance who tormented wrongdoers. To that soldier, these women were the Furies made flesh, embodiments of pure chaos. This sight alone was unnerving. But among the warriors and the women stood the druids themselves. Tacitus describes them lifting up their hands to heaven and pouring forth dreadful imprecations. The curses. This was the core of the attack. In an age when a curse was considered a supernatural weapon, the effect was devastating. They would have cursed the legionaries' swords to shatter, their shields to splinter, their limbs to grow heavy and weak. The air would have been thick with a cacophony of venomous prayer aimed directly at the heart of every soldier in those boats. The combined effect, the frenzied women, the torches, the curses, was overwhelming. It was a perfectly orchestrated symphony of terror. And it worked. Tacitus records the unthinkable. He writes that the Roman soldiers, as if their limbs were paralyzed, they stood motionless and exposed to wounds. For a critical moment, the unstoppable Roman war machine simply stopped. This wasn't cowardice. These were veterans of the 14th Legion, but their courage and discipline had been short-circuited by a profound primal fear their training had never prepared them for. They were facing an enemy that wasn't trying to break their shield wall, but to shatter their sanity. They stood there, in the boats or in the shallows, completely vulnerable. The spell could not hold. The line between victory and annihilation was razor-thin, and the Roman officers tipped the balance. Tacitus tells us, then, urged by their leaders, appeals, and their own mutual encouragement not to be frightened by a band of fanatical women and priests, they charged behind the standards. The centurions started shouting, cajoling, dragging their soldiers' minds back from the abyss and into the familiar brutal logic of combat. Slowly, then all at once, the paralysis broke, and the fear that had frozen them now turned into a burning, savage rage. They surged forward, a tide of steel crashing onto the beach. The terror they had felt was now unleashed upon their tormentors. The fight was not a battle. It was a massacre. They cut down the warriors, the women, and the priests without distinction. As Tacitus grimly notes, they enveloped the enemy in his own flames, likely using the very torches that had been brandished against them. The psychological war was over. The physical slaughter had begun. The fall resolution, the sacred groves. Burn, the Roman fury, once unleashed, was all-consuming. After annihilating the defenders on the shore, Suetonius and his legions moved across the island with ruthless efficiency. Their goal was not just to conquer, but to perform a kind of cultural exorcism. They marched on the sacred groves. To the Celts, these groves were their cathedrals. To the Romans, they were dark, malevolent places. Tacitus describes the scene with a chilling matter-of-factness. A force was next set over the conquered, and their groves, devoted to inhuman superstitions, were destroyed. Roman legionaries took axes to the ancient oaks. They tore down the altars. This was a declaration that Roman gods were stronger, that Roman order had triumphed over Celtic nature. It was a message to every tribe in Britain: your gods cannot protect you from Rome. Tacitus adds a final gruesome detail about what the Romans believed they found, writing, they saw altars covered with the blood of captives, and that the Druids consulted their deities through human entrails. This discovery, real or exaggerated, served as the ultimate justification. In their own minds, they weren't committing genocide. They were righteous executioners. The destruction of Mona was complete. But just as Suetonius was securing his brutal victory, a catastrophe was unfolding behind him. News arrived that a massive rebellion had exploded in the province. Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni, had risen in a furious revolt, burning the Roman colony of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, to the ground. The timing is hard to see as a coincidence. While we can't draw a direct causal line, many historians believe the assault on Mona was the final spark that ignited the Boudiccan rebellion. The attack on the spiritual heart of Britannia was an attack on all Britons. With their most revered leaders being exterminated, it may have felt like a last-ditch effort to expel the invaders who sought to destroy not just their bodies, but their souls. The great irony is that Suetonius himself had to abandon Mona, leaving only a small garrison, and force march his legions back to face a new, even greater threat. The priests of Mona were dead, but their fall had shaken the foundations of Roman power in Britain, unleashing the single bloodiest uprising in its history. The legacy, an echo in the mist. The Roman suppression was, in the long run, brutally effective. After Boudica's defeat and a second, more thorough invasion of Anglesey under the general Agricola in 77 AD, the Druids, as an organized force, were broken. Their centers of learning were destroyed, their leadership scattered, and their practices faded into folklore. Rome had achieved its objective. But this raises a critical question. How much of the Roman account is history, and how much is propaganda? Our sources, primarily Caesar and Tacitus, were Romans writing for Romans. By painting the Druids as bloodthirsty savages who burned people in wicker men, they created the perfect justification for their own campaign of cultural annihilation. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Archaeological evidence for ritual killing among the Celts does exist, like the bog bodies found across northern Europe. But it was almost certainly not as theatrical as Caesar described. The Wicker Man may have been a rare occurrence or a complete fabrication designed to shock his readers. Yet, the fear the Romans felt was undoubtedly real. Propaganda works best when it builds on a kernel of truth. The Druids did hold immense power. They were the intellectual and spiritual leaders of a culture fiercely resistant to Roman domination. Their combination of intelligence, secretive knowledge, and rituals that seemed barbaric to outsiders made for a genuinely intimidating presence. The terror felt by the soldiers at Anglesey was the result of a profound psychological shock. So why did Rome truly fear this priesthood? It was a perfect storm of threats. They wielded psychological warfare that could halt legions in their tracks. They were a political threat, a pan-tribal authority capable of unifying Celtic opposition. And their worldview, rooted in nature and oral tradition, was fundamentally incompatible with the Roman world of cities and written law. It was a rival system of thought that could not be absorbed. Finally, their alleged practices of human sacrifice provided the perfect moral justification for their destruction. In the end, Rome won. The legions conquered, the groves were burned, and the Druids vanished. But in trying to erase them, Rome inadvertently immortalized them. The very terror they inspired fueled the writings that preserved their memory. The Roman Empire could conquer lands and build walls, but for one terrifying moment on a misty shore, they faced an enemy that fought with